Samyo Hangma Rai, English instructor, and today we're going to deal with Unit 5, Life and Love, titled The Looking Glass. So let's begin.
Life and love. The best and the most beautiful things in this world cannot be seen or even heard, but must be felt with the heart. Helen Keller. So, this saying from Helen Keller, she means to say that not everything can be seen and even heard. Not everything beautiful can be seen and heard. But sometimes the most beautiful things must be felt by the heart. So for her, she means to say that love necessarily doesn't have to be seen or even heard. Love must be felt inside the heart. The looking glass. Before you read, question number A, what do you think a looking glass is? Basically, a looking glass is a mirror. Do you dream while you are asleep? Do dreams have meaning in real life? So, I think yes, most of us do dream when we are asleep. Maybe not always, but we do dream sometimes. And whether dreams have meaning in real life or not, that is how the dreamer takes it. So some believe that yes, dreams do have meaning in real life. However, some believe that no, dreams are just something that our brains have made up while we're asleep. Do you believe in imagination or reality? Why? So, you as a person, what do you believe in? Whether you believe in imagination or whether you believe in reality, that is completely up to you. However, you must be able to give us the reason why you believe in imagination or why you believe in reality. While most human beings like to believe in imagination, they imagine good things, such as perhaps a better job, a better life. Most of us usually, when we imagine, we always imagine something better. New Year's Eve. Nellie, the daughter of a landowner and general, a young and pretty girl, dreaming day and night of being married, was sitting in her room, gazing with exhausted, half-closed eyes into the looking glass. She was pale, tense, and as motionless as the looking glass. The non-existent but apparent vista of a long, narrow corridor with endless rows of candles, the reflection of her face, her hands, of the frame, all this was already clouded in mist and merged into a boundless grey sea. The sea was undulating, gleaming, and now and then flaring crimson. Here, we have the character called Nellie, who is the daughter of a landowner and a general. So she's a young and pretty girl who dreams of being married. In the first two paragraphs, she is in her room and she is exhausted. Her eyes were half closed into the looking glass. She was looking pale, tensed, and she was motionless, just as the looking glass. How a looking glass is an non-living object. It cannot move by itself. So she too was pale, tensed, and motionless, just like the looking glass. Looking at Nellie's motionless eyes and parted lips, one could hardly say whether she was asleep or awake, but nevertheless she was seeing. At first, she only saw the smile and soft, charming expression of someone's eyes. Then against the shifting grey background, there gradually appeared the outlines of a head, a face, eyebrows, beard. It was he, the destined one, the object of long dreams and hopes. The destined one was for Nellie everything, the significance of life, personal happiness, career, fate. Outside him, as on the grey background of the looking glass, all was dark, empty, meaningless. And so it was not strange that seeing before her a handsome, gently smiling face, she was conscious of bliss, of an unutterably sweet dream that could not be expressed in speech or on paper. Then she heard his voice, saw herself living under the same room with him. Her life merged into his. Months and years flew by against the gray background, and Nellie saw her future distinctly in all its details. So as mentioned in the first paragraph, Nellie dreams of being married. So the guy that she dreams of his smile first, which is soft, his charming expression, and then slowly, gradually, she dreams about how the outline of his head, face, eyebrows, and beards look. And for Nellie, that person is the destined one, the one she was meant to be with, the object, the person she is projecting onto as her future. So for Nellie, she sees that man as everything. Her personal happiness, her career, everything. But if she went outside that man, for her, life was meaningless if there was no man in her life. Not any ordinary man, that specific man that she was imagining of. Just even imagining that person, it made her very happy. It made her very feel blissful. And the bliss that she felt, it could not be expressed in speech or on paper. That feeling can only be felt in Nellie's heart. Just as Helen Keller mentioned, some things cannot be seen by the eyes or even heard. They can only be felt by the heart. Picture followed picture against the gray background. Now Nellie saw herself one winter night knocking at the door of Stefan Lukic, the district doctor. The old dog hoarsely and lazily barked behind the gate. The doctor's windows were in darkness. All was in silence. For God's sake, whispered Nellie. But at last the garden gate creaked and Nellie saw the doctor's cook. Is the doctor at home? His honor's asleep, whispered the cook into her sleeve as though afraid of waking her master. He's only just got home from his fever patients and gave orders he was not to be woken. But Nellie scarcely heard the cook. Thrusting her aside, she rushed headlong into the doctor's house, running through some dark and stuffy rooms, upsetting 2 or 3 chairs. She at least reached the doctor's bedroom. Stefan Lukic was lying on his bed, dressed but without his coat, and with pouting lips was breathing into his open hand. A little nightlight glimmered faintly beside him. Without uttering a word, Nellie sat down and began to cry. She wept bitterly, shaking all over. "My husband is ill," she sobbed out. Stefan Lukic was silent. He slowly sat up, propped his head on his hand, and looked at his visitor with fixed, sleepy eyes. "My husband is ill," Nellie continued, restraining her sobs. "For mercy's sake, come quickly. Make haste. Make haste." "Eh?" growled the doctor, blowing into his hand. Come this very minute, or it's terrible to think, for mercy's sake." This is still in Nellie's imagination. So in Nellie's imagination, she has rushed to the doctor, whose name is Stefan Lukic. So when she knocked on the door, the Stefan's cook opened it, and then the cook mentioned that the master had just reached home and they were given orders not to be woken up. But Nellie, in the state of mind that she was in, she did not hear anything, so she rushed towards the doctor's room. And then she began weeping. She was weeping for her husband. And she mentioned that her husband was ill. She was insisting the doctor to be quick. Hence she was saying, "Make haste, make haste." And pale, exhausted Nellie, gasping and swallowing her tears, began describing to the doctor of her husband's illness, her unutterable terror. Her sufferings would have touched the heart of a stone, but the doctor looked at her, blew into his open hand, and not a movement. "I'll come tomorrow," he muttered. "That's impossible," cried Nellie. "I know my husband has typhus. At once. This very minute you are needed. I have only just come in, muttered the doctor. For the last 3 days, I've been away seeing typhus patients, and I'm exhausted and ill myself. I simply can't. Absolutely, I've caught it myself. There. And the doctor thrust before her eyes a clinical thermometer. My temperature is nearly 40. I absolutely can't. I can scarcely sit up. Excuse me, I'll lie down. The doctor lay down. But I implore you, doctor, Nellie moaned in despair. I beseech you. Help me for mercy's sake. Make a great effort and come. I will repay you, doctor. Oh dear, why, I have told you already. Ah! So Nellie, she was gasping and she was swallowing her tears. Then she was beginning to describe what had happened to her husband, and she was terrified. And the doctor, he had muttered that he would not come. It was impossible for him to come. However, Nellie kept begging the doctor to come because she knew her husband had typhus. And then the doctor told her that for the last 3 days, he was busy watching or looking after typhus patients, and he was ill himself, and the fact that he himself had caught typhus. Then, to prove that he had caught typhus, he showed the thermometer to Nellie. The temperature was very high, and then he himself could not sit up. But Nellie, she was so insistent that the doctor must husband. She kept begging him urgently because she was afraid something bad, something worse might happen to her husband. Nellie leapt up and walked nervously up and down the bedroom. She longed to explain to the doctor, to bring him to reason. She thought if only he knew how dear her husband was to her and how unhappy she was, he would forget his exhaustion and his illness. But how could she be eloquent enough? Go to the Zemstvo doctor, she heard Stepan Lukich's voice. That's impossible. He lives more than 20 miles from here, and time is precious, and the horses can't stand it. It is 30 miles from us to you, and as much from here to the Zemstvo doctor. No, it's impossible. Come along, Stefan Lukich. I ask of you a heroic deed. Come, perform that heroic deed. Have pity on us. It's beyond everything. I'm in a fever. My head's in a whirl, and she won't understand. Leave me alone. But you are in duty bound to come. You cannot refuse to come. It's egoism. A man is bound to sacrifice his life for his neighbor. And you refuse to come. I will summon you before the court. Nellie felt that she was uttering a false and undeserved insult, but for her husband's sake, she was capable of forgetting logic, tact, and sympathy for others. In reply to her threats, the doctor greedily gulped a glass of cold water. Nellie fell to entreating and imploring like the very lowest beggar. At last, the doctor gave way. He slowly got up, puffing and panting, looking for his coat. Here it is, cried Nellie, helping him. Let me put it on to you. Come along. I will repay you. All my life, I shall be grateful to you. So Nellie, she was so desperate for the doctor to come and see her husband, and she thought that if she was able to express to the doctor how important her husband was and how unhappy she was, the doctor would eventually come to her. The doctor, who himself was ill, he suggested her to go to another doctor called the Zemstvo doctor. However, Nellie did not want to do so because from there, the Zemstvo doctor was 20 miles even further. Dr. Stefan was already 30 miles farther away from their house as it is, and the horses were not able to go farther. Now, in the moment of desperation, Nellie, she began hurting the doctor's ego. She said that a man is bound to sacrifice his life for his neighbor, and you refuse to come. So by saying this line, she is trying to hurt his ego. Not only hurt his ego, but also at the same time hurt his masculinity. At the same time, Nellie knew whatever she was saying, it was false. And the insults that she had hurled at the doctor, they were undeserving. But when it came to her husband, she forgot logic, tact, and sympathy for others, because her husband, for her, was everything. Her joy, her life, her career, her happiness, everything. So for her, she kept her husband before herself, and nobody else mattered when it came to her husband. Towards the end, Nellie, she helped, the doctor got up, and then eventually she also helped the doctor put on the coat, and she pleaded him and she told him that she would be forever indebted to him. But what agony! After putting on his coat, the doctor lay down again. Nellie got him up and dragged him to the hall. Then there was an agonizing to-do over his galoshes, his overcoat. His cap was lost. But at last, Nellie was in the carriage with the doctor. Now they only had to drive 30 miles and her husband would have a doctor's help. The earth was wrapped in darkness. One could not see one's hand before one's face. A cold wind was blowing. There were frozen lumps under their wheels. The coach person was continually stopping and wondering which road to take. Nellie and the doctor sat silent all the way. It was fearfully jolting, but they felt neither the cold nor the jolts. Get on, Nellie implored the driver. At 5 in the morning, the exhausted horses drove into the yard. Nellie saw the familiar gates, the well with the crane, the long row of stables and barns. At last, she was at home. Wait a moment, I will be back directly, she said to Stefan Lukic, making him sit down on the sofa in the dining room. Sit still and wait a little, and I'll see how he is going on. So for Nellie, not only getting up the doctor was the main thing. The doctor had to get up, put on his coats, his shoes, his cap. Now, after the doctor had gotten into the carriage, she was happy that within 30 miles her husband would have the help of a doctor. Nellie was so fearful for her husband, and finally at 5 in the morning, she recognized the barns, the stables, and she knew she was at home. Then she went inside, made the doctor sit in the dining room, and she told him that she was going to check and see what her husband was doing. Her husband, Nellie found the doctor lying down. He was lying on the sofa and muttering. Doctor, please, doctor. Eh? Ask Damna, muttered Stefan Lukic. What? They said at the meeting. Vlasov said. Who? What? And to her horror, Nellie saw that the doctor was as delirious as her husband. What was to be done? Must go for the Zemstvo doctor, she decided. Then again there followed darkness, a cutting cold wind, lumps of frozen earth. She was suffering in body and in soul, and delusive nature has no arts, no deceptions to compensate these sufferings. Then she saw against the grey background how her husband every spring was in straits for money. She saw her children, the everlasting apprehension of cold, scarlet fever, diphtheria, bad marks at school, separation. Out of a brood of 5 or 6, one was sure to die. So after she had left the doctor to sit on the sofa and she went to get her husband or to see how he was doing, when she returned she saw that the doctor was lying down and then he was muttering. He was also suffering with typhus. And then after that she knew that Stefan was of no help, and then she had to go to the Zemstvo doctor. However, had she not forced Stefan to come in the first place, she would have gone to Zemstvo and gotten a better treatment rather than going back and forth. Now she had to travel double of what she had assumed. Then she began imagining how her husband and her were in a state of distress every spring, and how to pay the interest to the bank, how they both could not sleep, and how their heads ached, thinking how they could be avoided being visited by the clerk. She also thought about her children, the scarlet fever and the contagious diphtheria, bad marks in school, and how she would be separated. And she knew that out of 5 or 6 children, one of them was sure to die. The grey background was untouched by death. That might well be. A husband and wife cannot die simultaneously. Whatever happened, one must bury the other, and Nellie saw her husband dying. This terrible event presented itself to her in every detail. She saw the coffin, the candles, the deacon, and even the footmarks in the hall made by the undertaker. Why is it? What is it for? She asked, looking blankly at her husband's face. And all the previous life with her husband seemed to her to a stupid prelude to this. Something fell from Nellie's hand and knocked on the door. She started, jumped up, and opened her eyes wide. One looking glass she saw her lying at her feet, the other was standing as before on the table. She looked into the looking glass and saw a pale, tear-stained face. There was no grey background now. I must have fallen asleep, she thought with a sigh of relief. Written by Anton Chekhov. For Nellie, she knew that both the husband and the wife cannot die simultaneously, because whatever had happened, the other must bury the other partner. She saw that her husband was dying, and how her husband dying, she saw everything in detail. She saw the coffins, the candles, the deacon, and even the footmarks of in the hall made by the undertaker. She asked why were the coffins there, the candles, and what were they there for? So something had fallen from Nellie's hand and it knocked on the floor. She jumped up, and her eyes were wide open. And then she saw that one of her looking glasses was lying at her feet, and the other was still there on the table just like previously. And then she looked in the looking glass, and then she saw that her face was pale and it was tear-stained, but there was no grey background. And with a sigh of relief, she thought that she must have fallen asleep. So whatever Nellie had imagined about her husband, the doctor falling sick, her husband's sickness, her desperation to bring the doctor to her house, whatever events that took place in this story, this was all Nellie's imagination. It was all in her dreams. So, to summarize the looking glass, there was a girl named Nellie, and she dreamt of being married. She used to imagine her husband, his looks especially, and then she imagined her husband being ill. She went to the doctor, Stefan, to come and aid her husband. The doctor denied, and she started hurling unnecessary insults and threats at him, regardless of him saying that he too was ill. However, for her, only her husband mattered. But when they reached home, the doctor too became as delirious as her husband. So the doctor had started babbling, and then she realizes that she has to go to the other doctor, who is 50 miles away from their house. And then she begins imagining how hard it was for her and her husband, and thinking of how to pay the interest of the mortgage to the bank. She even thought about their children, their illnesses, the bad grades, and how they were going to be separated. Because out of 5 or 6 children, eventually one was supposed to die. Then she began questioning about funeral. Then suddenly, a looking glass falls and it stays right besides her leg. She is startled. And then later, she realizes all the events that she had gone through was all just a dream. If you have any suggestions or feedback, please do not hesitate to contact us at learning@deerwalk.edu.np. Thank you.